Welcome to TradeTheNBA.com. This is John. This report is for the 4th of September. A pretty much flat day here as we opened up theoretic gap down, even though we kind of saw that in the futures that took place in the Asian European session before. It kind of finished back neutral right around that 2905-ish algo resistance level we had, which turns out to be also very much the 50% mark here. Which is at 0275, so around 03. So right in that range, it's pretty much hovering around. And what we've been looking at was still decent red from a DOC having reset. It was just a matter of waiting for a charge. We'd had the falling DOC steel, as well as shorts kind of fading out of it. So I think they were happy with what they got with that. And it won't take much to put it right back in place, except for you get a little bit of a shakeout dip. So we're kind of still in this trading range without a real strong indicator. We either need to see a move of green above cyan here. The fact that orange is moving above cyan would typically create a little bit more of a negative factor, particularly if we get a cyan pickup and steel moves below cyan, then you'd have a real short signal. But for now, we're sort of in that daily long. It's just kind of malaise. And I think we see it even later on when we look at the 50K as well as the choppiness of the 5K. So we'll take a look at those in a little bit. The NQ, pretty much similar. It's a little bit more bullish because it's had at least the rising, but now we have what they call like a duckbill effect where it just goes sideways with the readings right there. Here the orange is already ahead, so that's a bit more bearish than the S&P is. From a euro standpoint, new lows, but bought back up. Of course, now you got issues with the government in Britain. It looks like maybe they were able to stall Boris Johnson by removing one MP flip sides and created all this drama. So his idea of postponing the parliament during the holiday could be, affected, and so that was some bullish news because the idea that they may get a Brexit deal would be good for the euro because it basically would leave the EU intact because Britain and everything would pretty much stay the same. Still, with this far dip below the red line, there's still more sellers of euros than not. So I would expect that we're still going to come back and revisit those lows, even if we do see a pop at any point. But nothing about this indicates that that's on the horizon. Oil, bit of a dip there. So again, this is part of you have the hurricane going on, potentially the devastation there that it could cause, and also just concerns about whether or not there's enough demand growth in that. Obviously, later in the week, they're going to get a better idea when they see what the actual draws are and that. So in this case, though, we're still within the range, but certainly much weaker than we had been. This is kind of that configuration I like to look for when it comes to DOC spread or just shorts outside of the DOC spread. It meets all the criteria that you look for, where you have steel moving below cyan, where you have orange rising above both steel and cyan at the same time. And you've already got green below red DOC, and it doesn't hurt the DOC red falling, so that's not a surprise that we got exactly that. I love that configuration because it's pretty strong when it takes place. And here, gold, of course, we've been talking about this for some time, and continues its powerful rise, so all that's good. Small adjustment there. I realized I didn't have my Diocon Paint 2 on here for gold because that should still read all green going through there, and I got that back in place, so that's good to see it from that standpoint. Turning to the 5K chart, real quick here, it's pretty nice. We had some nice buildup. I think if I shrink it just a fraction, we'll be able to see a little bit more. But my favorite signals that come in when we get our lovely DOC readings. So we had a bunch of chop that was taking place in between. On your new Diocon Paint, you'll get a new adjustment for the BK readings. They're going to come in when you have, in this case, cyan moving above, green crossing below, and if you've had a cross of steel, usually you want to see, in this particular case, the difference between these two setups. The secondary version is even better because you're having steel coming from above red and then below. That makes a huge difference in its power. I mean, you have all four of them, which is the orange crossing above all of them, steel crossing below, well, in this case, red, as well as cyan, and then cyan, green already being below red, and it doesn't hurt if you're having red falling. That's like magic combination. This happened actually early on up in the bar. I was able to get up at the top level here, and that just boom, plummeted. And that's an easy one to follow too, especially if you're watching on a 5K falling shakeout magenta. It's not until it starts to flatten and then improve that you start to look for a buy. And in this particular case, we were talking about this. Negative 15.5 is what the program for the 50K has as a qualification with red above. In this case, we've talked about it being around negative 13.5, usually gives you the best runners as far as moves, and in this particular case, does it beautifully. You get a DLC spread that takes place right over here, and then the secondary one that is representative of all the little markers that we were just talking about. Initially here you have green below red, you have the orange moving above steel, steel crossing cyan. The only thing missing there would be having steel cross below red, but that's why you get a little bit of a delay before it actually starts to break down to that move. And then of course you got your reset with the orange dipping directly underneath green and red crossing, as well as the steel. So that's all of the markers for going back up. And then we just repeat the same. And then sometimes when you get into the situation where you don't get a cyan underneath, you can always look for another powerful one that I like, which is usually, again, it's that same as the DOC spread, only you don't have the cyan coming from underneath red, but you get it with the green cross below, both red, in this case, crosses below cyan as well. The steel crosses below, orange picks up above all of them, and it just gives you a nice high-end entry right there. It's particularly helpful if you have flat magenta, not rising, because if it's rising, you could be in the middle of a trend run. And in this particular case, it started lower immediately, but we were right at that same 29.05. This was interesting that this pop-up here failed right at mid-range in the 2012, 29.12 range, or whatever it was, yeah, 12.13, because we would have thought they would have tried to get it back up to the 23, which was kind of a precursor to let you know, it's like, okay, well, you've got to break this high if you're going to come back. And then later in the day, we had this nice little blue signal off of P2 pivot, gave the X for the buy right around 38%, and that one led to the move back over to 29.05, and then we just kind of consolidated right there. We had cyan underneath. A little bit of weakness here because, again, steel's coming from above. This dips below negative 13, that one goes above, and you get a crossover that would create a new potential short within even cyan under red. So that's something to look at from that standpoint. And then we can take a look at some of the changes that the 50K that we've been working on. So here's the last few days of the 50K setup. What you're going to begin to see a little bit different is where the BK numbers show up on the Diokon Paint 2. If you have the P1, actually, I gotta click on the actual bar. I can show you in the inputs, because you can choose to have them on or off. Depending on your preference, it's just a matter of selecting the input. So for P pivots, the 1 will show the print of everything. If you put a 0 there, it won't show it. The same thing if you wanted to see if there are new lows being made on the dip downs and whether or not orange has crossed underneath. So those are available in the input section if you wanted to be able to see them. It's significant because when we get to situations like this where we don't have a dip below red And we're getting that same configuration that I'm talking about, where that steel crosses below, green is crossed underneath, cyan is moved above green, as well as orange moved above all of them. And at that point, boom, you've got your short. Now, I was pointing out to this on the Skype chat as well. If you follow the orange and it stays above cyan, you pretty much can stick with your short run. When it dips back below, you can use that as a cover point, or wait for the full buy signal to come in. It's just the point being is that sometimes when you're in a chop situation, and we kind of knew that that's where we were at, gives you a heads up play to be able to take advantage of just a nice little short down move. And on a 50K, that can be anywhere from 7 points to 30 points in a small matter. In this case, turned around and produced decent buy setup that came in right through here on the pivots with the X. Another factor I look for, and you're seeing these dots, which probably haven't noticed much before. I talked about them once. What it's reflecting is the magenta and whether or not we're in a rising or falling scenario. So in this particular case, when they are green, it is a rising magenta, and when they turn red, it's falling, and white is just neutral, but it's flat. So you can take advantage better of, particularly when you've had a series run like this, when we get to a spot where it goes to neutral and you get this kind of crossover signal. Fares far better. In this particular case, happened to match where the sell came in for the market, which led us into a weakness pattern. And again, in this case, the orange dips below cyan pretty quick, meaning you didn't get a whole lot of juice out of a decline immediately. But we came back to the same configuration right over here as we dipped down, and the orange spiked above. And then we've kind of been in what I would refer to more as a sort of marginal bullish, because the red DOC has still been rising and holding up at the zero level. We've been caught in a continuation pattern, and the steel coming above cyan was bullish. And as long as that steel remains caught below the cyan here, you're still in a bullish mode. Now it's close to popping out. It almost did right here. We were talking about that on the Skype when that was happening, right about there, because if that did pop through, it would have met all the criteria for a short configuration. It just didn't do it. So in that particular case, it's like, okay, well, the long is still valid until that changes. So in this particular case, again, you have green below red with cyan above. Well, it's just a matter of that steel crossing below and the orange moving above. And you've already got the steel below at 75 to 226 for the cyan. The orange is at 203, so not a whole lot more needed to cross above, and that would create a modest short-term decline if you have flat to neutral checkout magenta. And in this particular case, it's still green rising, so not yet. I put up a configuration earlier that would be worth showing. So I thought something like this would be interesting, because then we can compare where we get some of these softer DOC spread setups where, like I was pointing out, we're still in rising magenta, and you get the subtle form. Now in this particular case, it's good. This isn't what we see from our normal prior DOC spreads for their setup, because what we're really looking for is we need to see that steel cross below as well as the orange crossing above, but it can happen within 5 to 6 bars prior to the actual cyan cross. And so even after it makes that move, I'm still not really excited about doing anything until I get a neutral to negative red on my magenta shakeout as a confirmation from the upturn, which gives me an entry that takes me right about there. And in this particular case, I can follow that as long as I'm staying within, and of course we get another DOC spread there, so if you needed to add in, certainly have that option. So this was your earliest read of it, which is above the 76%. Of course, then we get a secondary one that takes place right over here. A little bit less powerful. This would be a alternative version that I've created like an ABC, if you will, of DOC spreads that give their potency. This one qualifies because you have the steel rising above cyan and then back below, which gives you the cross there, and the same with orange below the green and back above, and rises up from that particular point. So if you were to follow, even from this one, from the secondary one, you made no new high, so there's no stop out potential within that. You're within, 15 points in this particular case to the highs from the 76, and you're over the 76. At that point, we can actually put down what that is. It was 1750, and the 100% all the way up at 44. So it's well within, I think, reasonable. It doesn't really go much higher than that anyway, with the high peak of this move. I just had it right there. Gets up to 37, and we just kind of trade away sideways until finally the dip move takes it all the way down to 19 3/4, and that's actually where the sell is now. What's going to happen is we're going to start to see those changes for some of the setups for the Power Mode 2 Opus, and they'll probably move back to the mid-range between the 0-100% when we get this kind of configuration, so that we'll be in relatively a neutral spot until it's a strong preponderance. But in this case, you can follow the red dots, and in this case, it works out perfect because an orange comes in, and once the orange comes in, it becomes opportunity to take it from that level. Secondarily, it's also going to take into account when we have dips below the red line, so that if there is a signal, the likelihood is if we're up at near the 23% or around that point when this kind of configuration comes, we'll know that we'll be able to wait for a move back down to at least 80% of that zero range from a trade out standpoint. So that will only augment what we get from a configuration standpoint. And likewise, you can see when that happens in some of these other cases where you get these kind of crossovers that technically usually don't meet the criteria we look for shorting, but going back through, looking at them, been very effective in calling tops at decent sized runs as well as small peak moves. Like in this particular case where we're buying right around the 50%, it gets the sell signal right about here, which is just over the 76. The current Opus, because of the more lenient stop parameters, turns what would be a positive trade. The first one being here. Bar over at 57, and the BK signal comes in at 63. And we end up not getting a sellout until 45. So it takes a loser and we'll turn it into a winner. And even on long runs, because of utilizing the power of the magenta rising versus neutral, we don't get caught in plateaus in the middle of runs to give us sell signals. So if you ever want to go back and run through, you can take a look at this chart, and you'll see configurations like this setup here. Again, it's that same steel dipping below. Orange comes above, but in this case, it was still within rising magenta boom, even though we were at the lows. In this particular case, then you go into the neutral, and you can follow that one down. You're going to find that there are fewer oranges on the new configuration that is going to be set up, because we're really looking for those situations where, again, we're getting to the right DOC red readings that are high enough up to justify a buy signal, as well as being in the right shakeout configuration that's going to give us some momentum to the upside. It doesn't mean we're always going to hit the very bottom as far as shorts for a low, but what it will do is allow us to put that into the program to where we'll be able to capture some of these runs. And you can see I've got some of the markers there. Some of these are 40, 50 point moves. Throw that into our Opus, and we're going to be having some big overall profit numbers, because we'll be on both sides of it. And it's going to be relevant given all this talk about imminent market collapse, which of course that's been going on for years now. And this video is going a little long, but I thought I would show you some of these things that are, evolving with the understanding of some of the changes that I've made to the algos that affect what has created the DOC readings, which makes them slightly different, even though they all look the same to you. They're just coming in slightly different locations than previous. And another indicator that's actually been in progress that I'm working on is the relationship between the spreads of the lines, probably something that you see on a regular basis as we expand with our cyan to green ratio, and it continues to enlarge, as well as you get, a bigger expanse of that gap. When it reaches a peak and starts to narrow, becomes more bullish, and vice versa. It's been a complicated one dealing with the negative numbers associated with it, but very effective and able to give us a trending mode as to whether the ratio is expanding or contracting, knowing whether you're expecting a stronger push versus a weaker one. So through the magic of time-lapse, I kind of moved over to a different time period here, where this was one of those situations where you're kind of in the middle, where there's this huge spread, and of course you're in this continuation, but you get that orange move above, steel cross below, with the green below red as the beginning cursor, where you have already falling magenta shakeout within that, and it's just a matter of being able to follow that falling magenta shakeout as we're in continuation. It's always important to remember that it's continuation when you're stuck between the red and cyan for a long period here. That usually is going to be a continuation move. In this particular case, by the time it turns to the rising magenta, in that case, we just see that it doesn't cross the negative 13.5 till right about there. And it's these kinds of changes that you're going to see both reflected in the paint bar that will then also flip to new buy configurations. Like in this case, there is no new buy for the Momo or the Power Mo from this standpoint, but that will get adjusted so that the new configuration will buy in that particular case and be able to follow all the way up to see where it says BK up here. It doesn't look like there's much of a decline. Not a big deal, because there's still a decline, so it'll still be able to take that, but then reinstitute on a new dip below red at this particular point right over here, where you can see it turns into the dark steel. It's a good indication for that, and then it rises even further before creating another one of those crossover moves. This one's more what we would call a weak setup, because you only have a few of the elements, because you're missing the steel crossing from above cyan. Where it makes up for it is the dip below negative 13.5 with above negative 13.5 for the orange. So that gave it clear, because sometimes you won't get those movements, and then it just becomes a pass because you're expecting a continuation at that point. So it's always good for everyone to be able to see some of the things that are developing from it, and how you can look at these items and utilize them for small trades in between the broader trends, both up and down. As always, though, I will update you on the Skype chat. We had a good conversation today. Trade well, and we'll talk again later.